The First National branch on Maple and Ninth smelled like burnt coffee and printer toner, the same way it had for as long as I could remember. I was standing in line behind a man arguing about a late fee, checking my watch, thinking about nothing more important than whether I'd make it back to the office before my 11 o'clock, when a young woman touched my elbow. "Excuse me, I am so sorry to bother you," she said, "but I need help, and I don't know who else to ask." She was maybe 24, dark hair pulled back in a rush, a folder clutched to her chest like it might try to escape. Her eyes were red-rimmed but dry, the look of someone who had already cried everything out an hour ago and was now running on nerve alone. "I'm listening," I said. "There's a man on a video call in 20 minutes, a bank compliance officer. He needs to verify my grandfather's identity before he'll release funds from his account funds my grandfather needs today for his heart medication and a hospital bill. My grandfather passed away 8 days ago." Her voice cracked on the last word, but she kept going, like stopping would break her completely. "I know how that sounds. I know it. But I'm not asking you to do anything wrong. I need somebody old enough, calm enough, who can just be present. Say a few words. Confirm a date of birth. That's it. 5 minutes." I should have walked away right there. Any sensible man would have. But something about the way she said my grandfather passed away 8 days ago, flat, exhausted, like grief that hadn't been given room to land yet snagged on something old in me, something I hadn't touched in 3 years. "Why me?" I asked. "Because you look like someone who wouldn't lie for fun," she said. "And because I'm out of time." I glanced at the folder in her arms. A single word was visible on the tab: Colton. My stomach dropped before my brain caught up to why. If this story has already caught your attention, let me know where you're watching from. Tell me your city and country in the comments. I love seeing where everyone is listening from. I want to tell you who I am before I tell you what happened next, because none of it will make sense otherwise. My name is Daniel Reyes. I'm 56 years old, divorced, and I raised my son Marcus, 17 now, taller than me, quieter than his mother ever was in the same house I grew up in, on the same street where my father spent the last, worst years of his life. I work as a claims investigator for an insurance company, which is a polite way of saying I spend my days figuring out who's lying and who isn't. It's a skill I didn't choose. It chose me. The year I turned 26. The year a man named Richard Colton walked into my father's life wearing a good suit and an easy smile, and walked out 4 years later with everything my father had built in 35 years of driving a delivery truck. Colton called himself a retirement strategist. He held seminars at the Elks Lodge with a free steak dinner and a laminated brochure showing a couple on a beach, captioned, "Your golden years, guaranteed." My father, Manuel Reyes, a proud, careful man who had never missed a mortgage payment in his life, sat through one of those dinners and came home believing he'd finally found someone smart enough to make his money grow the way it should have grown all along. 4 years later, the money was gone. Not lost, moved. Shuffled through annuities with penalties nobody explained. Managed accounts that bled fees every quarter. A reverse mortgage on the house that my father didn't fully understand he'd signed until the letter came, saying the bank now had a claim on his home. Colton was never charged. He was careful, technically legal, hiding behind fine print and arbitration clauses. My father had a stroke 18 months after the reverse mortgage letter. He never fully recovered his speech. He died 5 years later in a state-assisted care facility because there was no money left for anything better. And I have never, not for one single day, since stopped hearing his voice, trying and failing to say my name in that hospital bed. I hadn't heard the name Colton out loud in over a decade, and now it was sitting in a folder in a stranger's arms in the same bank lobby where I once tried, uselessly, to get anyone to explain to me where my father's money had gone. "What's your name?" I asked her. "Mia," she said. "Mia Alvarez." "Whose account is this, Mia? Really?" Her jaw tightened. "My grandfather's, Ernesto Alvarez. And the man running the verification call the compliance officer. His name is Preston Colton." Preston, not Richard. But the same last name doesn't happen by accident. Not with a name like Colton in a small town like this. "Is Preston related to a Richard Colton?" I asked. Something shifted in her face recognition, sharp and sudden. "His father. You know him." "I know exactly what that family does," I said quietly. "Mia, I think we need to have a very different conversation than the one you came here to have. We sat in her car in the parking lot because she said she didn't trust the bank's walls to be as private as they looked. And after everything I already knew about the Coltons, I didn't argue. The folder held 11 months of her grandfather's bank statements, a durable power of attorney document with a signature that Mia swore up and down her grandfather never made, and a printed email chain between Ernesto Alvarez and someone signing off as Preston Colton, Senior Wealth Advisor, Heritage Legacy Partners. My grandfather trusted him, she said. Preston came to the senior center where Grandpa played dominoes on Tuesdays. Free lunch, free seminar, same as always, I guess. Grandpa thought Preston was like a grandson to him. He talked about him at dinner. Preston says the market's going to correct. Preston says I should move things around. Preston's looking out for me. She laughed, and it wasn't a real laugh. Then Grandpa had his heart attack in April. Preston came to visit him in the hospital. Isn't that sweet? A wealth advisor at a hospital bed, holding an old man's hand. She pulled a page from the folder. 2 days after that hospital visit, this power of attorney was filed. My grandfather couldn't have signed anything 2 days after a heart attack. He could barely hold a spoon. But there it is. His name, his notary stamp, everything. Perfect. And now? I asked. Now, Grandpa's dead. And Preston is processing the estate transfer. And there's a video verification call in. She checked her phone. 15 minutes. Where he needs someone to confirm they're my grandfather's brother, a supposed co-signer on the account named Hector Alvarez, so the funds can be released to the family before probate freezes everything. Except there is no Hector. Preston invented him. I found the fake ID request in an email Grandpa's old laptop still had cached. Preston needed somebody, anybody old enough to be believable on a 5-minute video call, so the transfer looks legitimate to the actual bank's fraud department before they catch on. I sat with that for a long moment. It was the same architecture I remembered from my father's ruin, just rebuilt with new materials, new sun, new decade, same rot at the center. Richard Colton had aged out, or died, or retired into whatever comfort he'd stolen. And his son had inherited the business exactly as it was, a machine for turning trusting old men into empty accounts. You weren't going to ask me to lie to a bank, I said slowly. You were going to ask me to walk straight into Preston Colton's fraud and let him think it worked. I don't know what I was thinking, Mia admitted. I've had 8 days. I found this folder in Grandpa's desk 2 nights ago and I haven't slept since. I thought if I could just get in front of Preston, on camera, with a witness, I could catch him admitting something. I don't have a plan past that. I have grief and a folder and a deadline. I looked at my watch. 14 minutes. Change of plan, I said. You're still doing this call. But it's not going to be some stranger from a bank line playing your uncle. It's going to be me, telling Preston Colton exactly who I am, and exactly what his father did to mine. Her eyes went wide. That could tip him off. He could pull everything. Hide it. He's not going to hide anything, I said, because I'm not going to threaten him. I'm going to let him think he's still safe. Mia, I've spent 30 years learning how people lie when they think no one's watching. Your grandfather's case isn't the only one, is it? Men like Preston don't stop at one family. If we do this right, we don't just stop him from taking your grandfather's last dollar. We take him down for all of it. We didn't take the video call from the bank lobby. I had Mia reschedule it by 20 minutes, texting Preston's assistant that Uncle Hector was driving in from out of town and needed a few extra minutes. That gave me time to do 3 things. Call my old colleague, Renee Ashford, who now worked fraud investigations for the State Attorney General's Consumer Protection Division. Forward her everything in Mia's folder, and sit Mia down to explain, calmly, what I needed her to understand before we went any further. Renee can't act on a folder alone, I told her. She needs pattern, multiple victims, consistent method, ideally something recorded. If Preston says anything today that confirms he knew the power of attorney was fraudulent, or that he's using a fake identity to push a transfer past compliance, that's not just leverage, that's evidence. And if he doesn't say anything like that, Mia asked, then we get him talking until he does, I said. Men like this, men who've never been caught, they get comfortable. Comfortable people talk too much. At 11:20, We sat in my car outside a coffee shop with decent Wi-Fi. My laptop propped against the dash, camera angled so it caught me, and faintly, Mia beside me holding her phone up to record the audio separately, out of frame, insurance against anything going wrong with the platform's own recording. While we waited for the call to connect, Mia gripped the folder in her lap so tightly her knuckles went pale, and I found myself doing something I hadn't done in years, running through the same mental checklist my father used to recite before any hard conversation with a landlord or a boss, back when I was a boy, and didn't understand yet why he needed to rehearse being calm. Speak slow. Let them talk first. Don't show your hand until you know theirs. It struck me, sitting in that car, that I'd spent 30 years building a career out of a habit my father taught me, without ever meaning to teach it, a habit born from a lifetime of being underestimated by men in good suits. Preston Colton's face filled the screen. He had his father's jaw, his father's practiced warmth, a haircut too expensive for a man his age, a home office bookshelf behind him, staged with hardcover books that looked like they'd never been opened. "Hector, right? Great, thanks so much for hopping on," he said, all easy charm. "This is really just a formality. We want to make sure everything's clean before funds move, given, the sensitivity of the situation. So sorry for your loss, by the way." "Thank you," I said. "Ernesto was a good man." "The best," Preston agreed. And I watched him say it the way you'd agree that Tuesday follows Monday, a fact requiring no feeling at all. "So I just need to confirm a couple details for our compliance file. Can you state your relationship to the deceased and your date of birth for verification?" "Before I do that," I said, "I want to ask you something, Preston. Does the name Richard Colton mean anything to you?" A flicker. Small, but I've spent a career watching for exactly that kind of flicker. "That's my father." "Why do you ask?" "Because 30 years ago, your father sat across from my father, Manuel Reyes, at an Elks Lodge steak dinner, and told him he'd found the perfect retirement strategy. 4 years later, my father had nothing left but a reverse mortgage he didn't understand, and a stroke he never recovered from. He died with $62 in his checking account." Preston. $62 after 35 years of driving a truck 6 days a week. The charm didn't fully leave Preston's face, but it went thin, stretched over something colder underneath. "I'm sorry to hear that, but I don't see what my father's business, decades ago, has to do with." "It has everything to do with it," I said. "Because I'm not Hector Alvarez. There is no Hector Alvarez. Ernesto Alvarez had no brother by that name. I'm Daniel Reyes, and I'm sitting here with Ernesto's granddaughter, Mia, who found the power of attorney you filed 2 days after her grandfather had a heart attack, a document he couldn't have physically signed. You've been pushing an estate transfer using a fabricated identity to slip past your own bank's fraud protocols. That's not a compliance formality, Preston. That's wire fraud, elder financial abuse, and forgery. And I'd guess it's not the first time your family's business has done exactly this." The silence on the call stretched long enough that I heard Preston swallow. "You need to disconnect this call," he said, voice tightening. "I'm not going anywhere," I said. "But you should know, this conversation's been recorded, and it's already been forwarded to the Attorney General's Consumer Protection Division. A woman named Renee Ashford is going to be reaching out to you very soon. I'd get a lawyer, Preston. A real one. Not the kind your father used to keep old men quiet." He ended the call. The screen went dark. Mia let out a breath that had clearly been trapped in her chest since the parking lot. "Did we just do something incredibly stupid?" she asked. "Or incredibly smart?" "Both, probably," I said. "But it's done now. And it's not the end. It's barely the beginning." Renee called me back within the hour, and what she told me confirmed what I'd suspected the moment I saw the Colton name on that folder tab. Heritage Legacy Partners had 3 open complaints in the last 18 months, all from families of elderly clients, all describing some version of the same story. A warm, attentive advisor, a hospital visit at just the right moment, a power of attorney that appeared with suspicious timing, funds that moved in ways nobody could quite trace before the client passed or lost capacity. None of the complaints had gone anywhere. Elder financial abuse cases often don't. The victims are gone or too impaired to testify. Families are grieving instead of investigating, and men like Preston Colton know exactly how to make paperwork look clean enough to survive a first glance. What we've never had, Renee said, is someone recorded, on camera, essentially admitting knowledge of a fabricated identity being used to move funds. That's not nothing, Daniel. That's the thread we can pull. Over the next 10 days, Mia and I became an unlikely team. She tracked down 2 of the other families from Renee's list, a daughter in Ohio, whose mother had lost her retirement account to an annuity with penalties nobody explained, and a grandson in Arizona whose grandfather's home now had a lien on it that appeared 6 weeks before he passed. Both families, once they realized they weren't alone, were willing to talk. Both had noticed, in hindsight, the same warm visits at the same vulnerable moments. Both had documents with signatures that, under a forensic eye, didn't quite match anything else the victim had ever signed. The Arizona call stayed with me longer than I expected. His name was Ray, mid-30s, a mechanic with grease-stained knuckles, even on video, and he spent the first 10 minutes of our call apologizing for things that weren't his fault, for not visiting his grandfather more, for not asking harder questions about the lien letter that arrived the same week as the funeral, for believing, the way we all want to believe, that a friendly man in a good suit could simply be what he appeared to be. He used to bring my grandpa donuts, Ray said, staring somewhere off camera. Every other Thursday. Sat with him for an hour. Listened to his stories about Korea. I used to think, man, I wish I had that kind of patience for the old man. Turns out, he was just doing his homework. I didn't have anything comforting to offer him. Not really. What I had was a question: would he be willing to put his account in writing, sworn, for Renee's office, and he said yes before I finished asking. That was the pattern I started noticing across every family Mia and I spoke to. Nobody hesitated once they understood they weren't alone. Grief that isolates a person turns out to unlock fast once it finds company. I sat with Marcus one night at the kitchen table, going through timelines with him, not because I needed his help exactly, but because for the first time in years, I wanted him to see what this work actually was. He'd grown up knowing his grandfather only from photographs, and the sound of my voice going quiet whenever his name came up. He didn't know the whole story. I'd protected him from it the way you protect a kid from a fire you're still standing inside. He did this to other families too, Marcus said, looking at the pattern laid out across 3 folders. Not just to us. His father did it to us, I said. He's doing it to them, Dad. Marcus looked up at me, and for a second he looked exactly like his grandfather, same stubborn set to the jaw. Are you doing this for me as grandpa, or for yours? It was a fair question, and I owed him an honest answer. Both, I said. I couldn't save my father. I was too young, too trusting, too slow to understand what was happening until it already had. I can't go back and fix that. But I can make sure it costs Preston Colton everything it should have cost his father 30 years ago. That's not revenge for its own sake, Marcus. That's finishing something that should have been finished a long time ago. Heritage Legacy Partners occupied the top floor of a glass office building downtown, the kind of address designed to make an 80-year-old man feel like his money was in careful, respectable hands. Renee's investigation moved fast once the pattern was documented. 3 families. Consistent method, recorded admission on the call. A subpoena for Heritage Legacy's internal records followed 2 weeks later, and with it, a request that I come in to give a formal statement. Preston Colton was in the building that day. I hadn't planned to see him, but the elevator opened on his floor at the exact wrong moment, and there he was, flanked by a lawyer in a suit sharper than his own, face gray in a way that no amount of expensive haircut could disguise. You destroyed my business, he said low enough that only I could hear it, over something my father did before I even worked there. Your father built the business, I said. You just kept running it exactly the way he taught you. That's not an accident, Preston. That's a choice you made every single time you sat across from someone's grandfather and smiled. You don't know what it's like, he said, growing up in his shadow, trying to prove you belong in the same rooms he did. For one strange second, I almost felt something for him, some echo of understanding, one son standing in the wreckage his father made. But then I thought of my own father, trying and failing to say my name in a hospital bed, and the sympathy burned off like fog in sunlight. I grew up in a shadow too, I said, the shadow of an empty bank account and a stroke that took my father's voice. The difference between us, Preston, is that I spent 30 years learning to catch people like you. You spent 30 years learning to become one. His lawyer stepped between us, said something about not discussing an active investigation, and steered him away. I let him go. I didn't need the last word in a hallway. I needed the paperwork, the statements, the subpoenaed records, the kind of ending that actually holds. Here's the part I didn't see coming. 3 weeks into the investigation, Renee called me with something that made me sit down at my kitchen table before I could process it standing up. Going through Heritage Legacy's client records as part of discovery, her team found a file from 11 years earlier, a smaller account. Closed out quietly. Client deceased shortly after. The client's name was Manuel Reyes. My father's account hadn't closed the way I'd always believed. Quietly and completely. The year before his stroke, there had been a final transaction 6 months before his death, a small one. Embarrassingly small compared to everything else that had already been taken. A few $100s moved from a dormant account nobody in the family knew still existed. The advisor of record on that final transaction wasn't Richard Colton. It was a 22-year-old junior associate at the firm at the time, listed under his full legal name. He'd been there. At the very end of what his father started, Preston himself had signed off on the last few $100s taken from my father's account, years before he ever ran the business himself, years before Mia's grandfather ever sat down to a free steak dinner. He hadn't just inherited his father's methods, he'd been trained on my father's file. I sat with that for a long time. It would have been easy to let it turn into something uglier in me, a need to make Preston suffer beyond what the law would give him, some private reckoning that had nothing to do with justice and everything to do with grief, finally finding a face to aim at. I thought about it. I won't pretend I didn't. I thought about driving to Heritage Legacy's office and saying things I couldn't take back. I thought about calling every reporter in the state and making sure Preston Colton's name was the first thing anyone saw when they searched it. For the rest of his life, I sat at that table for almost an hour, running through versions of anger that would have felt, in the moment, like justice and would have cost me, in the end, everything careful and patient I'd built in 30 years of learning how to actually catch someone instead of just wanting to hurt them. But Marcus came downstairs while I was still sitting there, saw my face, and asked what was wrong. And when I told him all of it, finally, the whole story, not the version I'd been protecting him from, he didn't ask me what I was going to do to Preston Colton. He asked me something better. What would Grandpa want you to do? I thought about my father, a man who never once, in all the years I knew him, raised his voice at anyone who'd wronged him, not the bank, not the mechanic who overcharged him, not even Colton, in the beginning, when he still believed it was all a misunderstanding. My father's whole life had been built on quiet dignity, on doing right even when the world did wrong by him. He'd want it done properly, I said, in a courtroom, not in a parking lot, not in a hallway. He'd want the law to say his name and mean it. The case against Preston Colton and Heritage Legacy Partners took the better part of a year to fully resolve. He wasn't charged with what happened to my father. Too much time had passed. The older record's too thin to build a fresh case around a name from over a decade back. But the state didn't need that case. It had Ernesto Alvarez's forged power of attorney, the fabricated Hector Alvarez identity, the recorded call, and, once the dam broke, 6 additional families who came forward once the news covered the arrest. Preston pleaded to multiple counts of financial exploitation of the elderly and forgery. He lost his license, his firm, and eventually his freedom for 18 months, with restitution ordered to every family who could still be located. I sat in the gallery on the day of sentencing, between Mia and Ray, who'd flown in from Arizona for exactly this. The courtroom was smaller than I'd imagined. Fluorescent lit, nothing like the glass tower Heritage Legacy had operated out of. Preston stood at the defense table in a suit that no longer looked expensive on him, just borrowed, like a costume from a life he didn't get to keep. When the judge read the list of victims into the record, Ernesto Alvarez, Ray's grandfather, 3 others whose names I'd learned over the past year, and, almost as an afterthought, a note that the court had reviewed additional historical conduct involving a Manuel Reyes. I felt something in my chest unclench that had been tight for 30 years. Nobody in that room called it closure. It didn't feel that clean, but it felt like the truth. Finally, being said out loud in a place built to make the truth matter. It didn't bring my father back. It didn't undo the stroke, or the years he spent trying to say words that wouldn't come, Or the $62 in a checking account that should have held a lifetime of careful work. Nothing was ever going to undo that. I stopped expecting it to, somewhere around the third week of the investigation, when I finally understood that the justice I'd been chasing for 30 years wasn't going to feel like victory. It was going to feel like relief. Quieter. Heavier. Enough. Mia's grandfather's estate was restored in full. The fraudulent transfer reversed before it ever completed. She sent me a photograph a few months later, her, at his gravesite, laying flowers on what would have been his 81st birthday. A small handwritten note in the corner. He'd have liked you. He always said the good ones show up when you don't expect them. I keep that photograph in the same drawer where I keep the only picture I have of my father driving his delivery truck, young and unbothered, decades before Richard Colton ever walked into his life with a laminated brochure and a stolen smile. I take them both out sometimes, on the hard nights, and I remind myself that some debts do eventually get paid, even if it takes 30 years and a stranger's granddaughter at a bank counter to collect them. Ray and I still talk, every few months, mostly about nothing, his shop, my work, the way grief eventually settles into something you carry, instead of something that carries you. Mia finished her degree that spring and started volunteering with a legal aid clinic that helps families spot exactly the kind of fraud that took her grandfather, teaching people the questions I wished someone had taught my father 30 years earlier. I like to think Ernesto and Manuel would have gotten along. Two careful men from two careful generations, swindled by two versions of the same smile, saved in the end by the people who loved them enough to keep asking questions after they were gone. Marcus asked me, not long after the case closed, whether I felt like I'd finally won. I don't think this was ever about winning, I told him. It was about making sure nobody else's father ends up with $62 and a silence he can't break. That's not a win, son. That's just what love looks like. 30 years too late, but not one day later than it had to be.